Ever stop to think how a decision made, like, thousands of miles away, aimed at one country, could totally change something as basic as buying a car in another?
Pretty incredible, yeah.
Imagine someone in Nigeria saving up, planning to buy a vehicle, and then suddenly this brand new U.S. trade policy just throws a major curveball.
Mm.
Okay, so let's unpack this seemingly distant connection.
It's actually remarkable how these economic policies, ones designed with a really specific local focus, can generate such widespread and, well, often unexpected effects across the globe.
Absolutely. So today we're diving deep into what looks like a simple announcement. The U.S. is bringing in a 25% tariff on vehicle imports. It's set to kick in April 2025.
Right.
And our goal here is to really understand how this U.S. policy, which seems all about the American car market, right? How it could have
Mm.
a big impact on the auto market way over in
Yeah.
Nigeria. We've got a VOA article from, let's see, February 28th, 2025, to kind of guide us through this. And for you listening, this is a chance to quickly get a handle on just how interconnected our world economy is using this, well, pretty surprising example.
And it's a powerful illustration, really. In today's globalized world, I mean, very few economies operate completely on their own. What happens in one major market can send these ripples far, far beyond its borders.
So, okay, before this new U.S. tariff even enters the picture, what was the situation actually like in Nigeria's auto market? The article introduces us to David Tope. He's a Nigerian automotive importer.
Hmm.
And apparently he used to import quite a few vehicles, maybe up to 5 each week, from the U.S. and Canada. But by early 2025, he'd already had to pause his business. So what was going on there? What were the roadblocks he was hitting?
Well, the article points to a couple of pretty significant financial pressures that were already squeezing importers like Mr. Tope. The first big one was the falling value of Nigeria's currency, the naira.
Ah, okay. Currency devaluation.
Exactly. When the naira loses value against the dollar or, other major currencies, it just makes anything imported much more expensive. Simple as that.
Right.
And then the second factor was increases in import duties within Nigeria itself. So another layer of costs getting added on.
Right. And Mr. Tope is actually quoted saying something like, it's not just about where the cars are coming from. Our inflation rate is so high on the duties and the naira has devalued so much, it's making it tough to import from anywhere.
Yeah, that really sums it up.
He even suggested, that the government might need to rethink those customs duties just to keep the car dealership business, like, accessible for regular folks. So even before this U.S. policy, things were already pretty tough going.
Exactly. The Nigerian auto market was already, you could say, navigating some serious economic headwinds. And that context is really vital to understand why a U.S. tariff, one that doesn't even directly target Nigeria, could still have such a strong knock-on effect.
Okay, yeah, this is where the connection gets really interesting, isn't it? This new 25% U.S. tariff, it's on vehicles as they enter the United States.
Correct.
But the article stresses that Nigeria relies really heavily on used car exports from America. So how does a tax happening in the U.S. become, well, a headache in Nigeria?
Okay, so the crucial point here is what happens to the price of those used vehicles within the U.S. market because of the tariff?
Right.
If the cost for a U.S. dealer to bring certain used cars into the U.S. goes up by 25%, maybe cars originally from Canada or Mexico, let's say that increase is very likely to be reflected in the asking price when those same cars are then sold on.
Ah, I see.
Whether they're sold to an American buyer or, critically here, to exporters who are planning to ship them to places like Nigeria. As Mr. Tope quite rightly worried, a potential 25% inflation rate on U.S. cars will be unbearable for Nigerian car dealers.
So it's like the initial cost base for the car in the U.S. goes up.
Precisely. Think of it like this. If a used car dealer in the U.S. has to pay 25% more to get a particular imported car onto their lot, they'll naturally need to charge more for it when they sell it. Doesn't matter who the buyer is.
He even makes what seems like a really important distinction in the article. He says, if the cars were originally made in the U.S., maybe it wouldn't be quite the same cost issue. But the real problem pops up when cars are imported into the U.S. first, maybe from elsewhere, and then they get re-exported to Nigeria. That 25% U.S. import tariff becomes this added layer of expense baked into the price.
That's exactly the point. It's less about the car's original manufacturing location and more about whether it crosses that U.S. border becomes subject to the tariff before it potentially gets shipped out again to Nigeria.
Oh.
That added cost just becomes part of the vehicle's price tag for the Nigerian importer down the line.
And it sounds like Nigerian consumers are already feeling a massive squeeze. I mean, the article mentions vehicle prices in Nigeria have jumped by almost 400%
Yeah, it's staggering.
in just the last 2 years. That's a huge increase.
It really is. And that huge jump, that reflects those existing economic pressures we just talked about, the currency devaluation, the
Right.
local duties.
Right.
So the expectation is that this new U.S. tariff will only make those price problems even worse. It's going to push car ownership even further out of reach for many Nigerians who really rely on these, relatively affordable used vehicles.
Yeah, the human impact comes through. We hear from people like Emmanuel Aaron in the article, who basically says he's had to, quote, suspend his plans to buy a car just because they've become so expensive.
Understandable.
And another person, Akintunde Akinmole, he still values the quality he sees in American cars, but he's really worried now that the cost is just going to outweigh any of those benefits. It really shows the personal side of these big economic shifts.
Absolutely. These individual stories, they really bring these abstract economic concepts right down to earth, don't they? It's not just about trade figures and percentages. It's about people's daily lives, their ability to get to work, to transport their families, things that have a huge impact on their overall well-being.
So let's maybe zoom out a bit then. What are the kind of broader economic consequences for Nigeria that this U.S. tariff might set off? There's an economist quoted, Hawa Mustafa.
Yes.
She suggests this could actually reshape Nigeria's entire auto market. How does she see that playing out?
Well, Ms. Mustafa's analysis is, I think, very insightful. She suggests that if the U.S., partly because of this new tariff, starts to prioritize its own local vehicle production more,
Okay.
then there might simply be fewer used cars available for export in the first place. Just less supply hitting the global market from the U.S.
Oh, okay. A supply issue.
Right. And a reduced supply would naturally lead to higher prices for those used cars that are still exported to countries like Nigeria. So, you see, even if Nigeria doesn't apply any new tariff itself, the reduced availability and the increased prices originating in the U.S. market will have a direct impact.
That makes logical sense, basic supply and demand, right? Less available supply usually means higher prices.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just the price of the cars themselves. She also points out the risk to the whole ecosystem of businesses in Nigeria that depend on these used car imports.
You mean like...
Well, we're talking about the importers, obviously, like Mr. Tope, but also the mechanics who service these cars, the spare parts dealers, the people involved in transporting the vehicles inland. Potentially thousands of livelihoods could be affected.
Wow, it's a real chain reaction across different sectors then.
It absolutely is.
Now, the article does touch on Nigeria's own domestic auto industry. It sounds like currently they only produce around, 14,000 vehicles each year?
Yeah, something like that.
Which is apparently a tiny fraction of what the country actually needs or demands. So the general agreement seems to be that long-term, a stronger local manufacturing sector is the real answer.
Absolutely. That's widely seen as the sustainable solution. However, building up a strong domestic auto industry, well, that's a huge undertaking. It takes a lot of time, a lot of investment. Mrs. Mustafa particularly emphasizes the need to revitalize and strengthen Nigeria's steel industry. That's seen as a really foundational requirement. You can't really build cars at scale without a robust local steel production capability, or at least reliable access to it.
Right. You need the basic materials, all these pieces of the economy, they're interconnected.
Exactly. And she also mentions the importance of improving Nigeria's infrastructure more broadly. Things needed to better support the assembly of vehicles that is already happening locally, even if it's small scale right now.
So it's not just about building brand new factories from scratch.
No, it's also about creating a more supportive environment for the existing local production to actually expand and become more competitive. That means things like reliable electricity, good roads for transport, and of course, a skilled workforce.
Gotcha. So as things stand right now, the article indicates that Nigerian importers, people like David Tope, they're basically in a wait-and-see mode, understandably unsure about what the actual on-the-ground impact of this U.S. tariff will be on their businesses and, well, the wider market.
Yeah, that sense of uncertainty is a completely natural reaction to such a potentially significant shift in, global trade dynamics. They really need to see how the U.S. policy gets implemented, how it truly affects the supply and the cost of used vehicles coming out of the U.S., and then figure out how they might be able to adapt their operations, if at all.
Okay, let's try and wrap this up then. The core takeaway here seems pretty clear. A policy decision made in the U.S. one seemingly focused entirely on its own car market,
Yeah.
can have really significant and maybe unexpected consequences for a country like Nigeria. And it's all because of how interconnected the global economy is, especially when it comes to something like the used car trade.
It really does highlight the intricate nature of international economics, doesn't it? And also how relying heavily on specific import channels, like Nigeria does for used cars from the U.S., can create vulnerabilities for national economies. A decision that looks purely local on the surface can end up having these profound and far-reaching effects halfway across the world.
This whole situation, it really makes you think, doesn't it? What other seemingly, localized policies might be out there right now with these kinds of far-reaching, maybe unintended global consequences that we just don't often consider?
Hmm, that's a great question.
It's definitely worth pondering those unseen connections in our global economy. It seems it's all a lot more tightly woven together than we sometimes realize.